Hey everyone, I'm Chris Luzniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast. Let's talk about pacing guides. What are they? Why do we have them? How much should we follow them?
this topic has caused quite the stir in many schools among colleagues. Some educators believe pacing guides may not be effective or even necessary, while others believe pacing guides are needed so we can stay on track to cover all of our grade level content.
Well, it sounds like a great topic for debate, so let's dig right in. And here, arguing for pacing guides that we should follow them, we have two awesome educators. First up is a former elementary educator and math coach, co author of the new curricular resource, Let's Talk Math, engaging students as mathematical thinkers, as well as the books Partnering with Parents in Elementary School Math and Adding Parents to the Equation, who also has a black belt in Taekwondo. So watch out, opposing side. It's Dr. Hilary Kreisberg. Hi, Hilary.
Hi.
Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Sure. I'm in Massachusetts, and I'm currently the director of the Center for Mathematics Achievement at Lesley University. And there I oversee a team of consultants who provide high quality professional development and learning opportunities, as well as conducting research on the current issues in mathematics education.
Wonderful. Welcome. And arguing along with her is an educator who is proud to have engaged in teaching and learning mathematics with pre K through PhD students and educators in multiple countries over the years, and who is also pretty good with sports and music trivia. It's Farshid Safi. Hi, Farshid.
Hi, everyone.
Can you let us know where you are and what your current role is?
Well, first of all, I'm not good at sports. I'm good at sports trivia. So let's get that out, really quickly. I'm in Orlando, Florida. I'm currently an associate professor of K-12 mathematics education at the University of Central Florida. And I have the pleasure of working with prospective elementary as well as secondary teachers and current teachers in our graduate programs, including master's programs, and some brilliant colleagues who are doing their doctorates in mathematics or STEM education. And regularly, I'm in schools all over the country, collaborating with teachers, providing professional development, and anything related to just providing a sense of coherence, connections, but making sure that we continually center our students, empower our teachers, and do it in an equitable fashion.
Awesome. And now the question we want to ask all of our guests is, when did math first become controversial to you? And I'll start with you, Hilary.
It was my freshman year in college. I was a math major, and I was one of maybe three women in the program, of which only two of us ended up finishing. Our classes had 20 to 25 students, and it just became really apparent to me, just from looking around the room, that this was not an equally balanced subject. And it became more controversial for me when, in my history of mathematics course, I received an A minus on a group project, yet all my male counterparts received an A, despite me being the significant contributor to the project. So that's where it became controversial.
Thank you for sharing. And Farshid?
I'm just, listening to Hillary, just, whew, yeah. So for me, it was when I realized I was in my undergraduate program, majoring in mathematics and minoring in secondary education, when mathematics was being taught strictly in the abstract sense and without context. It didn't seem to coincide with our everyday experiences. And in fact, removing that relevance and the connections to our human existence just felt off. And so they would talk about commutative property or simplifying fractions or efficient strategies, but none of that without context actually made sense, and it made things worse. So oftentimes when people decouple the math content and context, then to me, mathematics sort of became problematic and sort of has stayed problematic and controversial when that happens.
Thank you both.
And we have a team of two awesome educators arguing against pacing guides. First up is an educator, author, founder of Identity Talk Consulting, editorial writer, and influencer for Brightbeam Inc., host of the Radical Math Talk podcast, and karaoke fanatic, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. Hey, Kwame.
Hey, how you doing, Rob and Chris? It's an honor to be on a Debate Math podcast. And just a little bit about myself. In a previous life, I was a math teacher, so I taught middle school math both in Philadelphia and also in Boston. So hearing Hilary talk about Lesley University, the Greater Boston connection there. And currently, a lot of my work is now focused on providing professional development through my firm, Identity Consulting, which focuses on the importance of integrating anti-bias and anti-racist practices into our instruction, but also in our daily work with students and also with our colleagues in our school settings.
Thanks, Kwame. Welcome. And arguing along with him is an educator, elementary math coach, and consultant whose favorite food is a burrito made in California. It's Berkeley Everett. Hey, Berkeley.
Hey, everyone. So excited to be here.
Can you let us know where you are and what your current role is?
Yes. So I'm in Los Angeles, and as a CGI math coach for the UCLA Mathematics Project, my job is to go into classrooms across Los Angeles and collaborate with teachers, which I think is a different way than most people think of coaching, right? It's more of like a top-down approach, but I'm learning alongside teachers and students every day.
Wonderful. And now the question that we ask all of our guests: when did math first become controversial to you? Kwame, I'm going to start with you.
Well, Rob, I think it's a typical story that you hear from a lot of math learners. K through 12, I was an honor roll math student. Math was just so easy, but it was because we focused primarily on just the procedural way of solving math problems. So I didn't have any conceptual idea of how these steps were formulated. But then when I got to college, and I was a math major in college, and I started to take all the calculuses, the differential calculuses, linear algebras, and the number theories of the world, I started to realize the abstract nature of mathematics. So instead of going from performing computations, now I'm trying to prove and disprove conjectures and theories with counterexamples. So it wasn't just about numbers. Now it's just about logic. How do we make sense out of these theorems that we use to solve these computations? And I was a straight C student throughout my years in undergrad. And I started to question whether or not I was really a math learner, like the strong math learner that I thought I was during my first 13 years of schooling. So I believe that was the moment when math became controversial. And then, of course, when I became a math teacher and realized, similar to what Farshid said, just how these different concepts were put together and how there's actually a significance behind the steps that we did to solve these different problems. That blew my mind. So I would say that would be the second time when I thought that math was controversial for me.
Well, thank you, Kwame. And Berkeley, when did math first become controversial to you?
I'm going to interpret your question as meaning that mathematical ideas were up for debate. And that was freshman year of high school when I entered a class that was sort of non-traditional. The teachers were trying out CPM. So shout out to CPM, and my teachers for trying something new. And it was different because the teacher didn't give us the answer. They asked us to work on some different difficult problems. They were situated in contexts that were interesting and meaningful. And then we debated and we argued about it, and we came to a collective understanding together. And I guess another bigger piece to this story is just the fact that these teachers had to kind of fight for this program. It was kind of controversial that they were doing this instead of the traditional approach to mathematics. And it was also sort of controversial who was funneled into this class. This was a class that was seen as for struggling students, which I guess is good because they benefited from great mathematical instruction. But who do we think should be doing what kind of math? And I guess I was lucky to be in that class.
Thank you all. And with that, let's get into this debate. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. Each of you have 2 minutes to present your arguments. And we're starting with the side arguing for pacing guides. Hilary, you're up first, and your time begins now.
We are here today to discuss whether or not pacing guides should be used in schools, and our claim is that they are necessary tools, especially for mathematics educators. Pacing guides are documents that outline prospective year's content and projected pace, which aids teachers in giving all learners the opportunity to receive the same learning outcomes by the end of the school year. Pacing guides do not dictate to teachers how to teach the content, but instead outline what all students should know and be able to do by the year's end. Pacing guides provide students the opportunity to learn the same content as their peers, and as a result, should focus on learning and not on coverage. As a first year elementary teacher, I remember the daily anxiety of trying to figure out what to teach, how to teach it, and at the same time, trying to keep up the pace with all of my fellow veteran teachers. I also taught all content areas, as many do in elementary. Without a pacing guide, and at the time, an adopted curriculum, I was left to figure it out on my own and lacked the resource of time to collaborate with my teammates. Pacing guides don't just benefit novice teachers. Many veteran teachers find some of the topics they teach more comfortable for them and then spend more time covering it, even if it's not a critical component of the year's outcomes, ultimately sacrificing instructional time on more vital content. From a leadership perspective, as teachers are often siloed to their classrooms, pacing guides help administrators provide more mentorship, support, and intervention to ensure all students enter the next grade level having exposure to the same content. And I believe the reason that we're actually here debating about pacing guides in the first place is because many leaders have misused them as evaluative tools that put undue pressure on teachers solely based on pace, not learning. And ultimately, the effects of pacing guides really depend depend on their design and how school leaders use them. A good pacing guide should emphasize curriculum guidance, not prescriptive pacing, and it shouldn't be used to monitor teachers' coverage or pace in a punitive way, but rather help them determine a proper sequence of topics that develops coherent math learning and estimates coverage time, but is a living document that is updated frequently based on the students in front of you.
All right, thank you. And now we will hear from the side arguing against pacing guides with Berkeley Everett. Berkeley, you have 2 minutes, and your time begins now.
Pacing guides, as they are currently constructed and implemented, distract us from two important questions. Number one, how can we center students during our planning process and throughout the year? And number two, how can we offer opportunities to grapple with the big ideas of mathematics, not just the mathematics of a specific grade level? This leads to other questions and ideas like, how far ahead can you plan specific lessons before you are no longer student-centered? In the summer before a school year, how do you know that on day 57 of fourth grade that all students should spend 60 minutes on the standard algorithm? We wouldn't accept this in other areas of our life. Like, how far in advance do you want a restaurant to make your meal before you eat it? Right? We want our food to be fresh, and I want our math to be cooked to order. Kids deserve only the freshest, locally sourced math. And when students are centered, we don't feel the urge to label them as high or low. We're focused on their strengths and individual next steps. Pacing guides reinforce the idea that learning is linear and you're either ahead or behind. Let's jump into a classroom. Megan Akins gave her kindergarten students a word problem involving 6 groups of 7. All of them understood they were making equal groups, and almost all of them got the correct answer, 42. If you're watching the video, you can see pictures of the student work. How did kindergartners do so well on a 3rd grade standard? Well, Megan regularly poses problems using context her students understand and lets them solve it any way they want. To plan upcoming lessons, she follows her students' understandings, and she does not use a pacing guide. Let's give teachers the power to center students and engage them with the big ideas of mathematics.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from the side in favor of pacing guides again with Farshid. Farshid, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
Sure, thank you so much. Pacing guides as flexible roadmaps are key to ensuring that the scope and sequence of mathematical experiences serves student needs, as well as academic and school needs over space and time. By outlining intentional areas of emphasis and key ideas, teachers can collaborate on consistent mathematical notions across coherent progressions that help to connect concepts. Another key aspect of pacing guides relates to supporting teachers. whether we are talking about teachers new to the profession, new to a school and a team, or just new to a grade or a course sequence. It is unfair to expect teachers who are often isolated, who are made to be isolated, or who feel isolated, to arrive at the what, the when, the how, the why of teaching students different topics along their mathematical journey without this roadmap. So any pacing guide should allow for teachers, again, to flexibly exercise their creativity and their professional judgment. We need to shift away from this binary mindset that we either have flexibility in teaching or a rigid pacing guide that predetermines what, when, how, why, and for whom topics should be taught. A pacing guide can provide a negotiable roadmap. It should be negotiated in collaboration for teachers to bring in relevant contexts, resources, tools, and students' cultures and lived experiences that are critical in engaging our students in meaningful mathematics. Then teachers and collaborative teams can determine key stops on this journey, deciding when we should linger over important concepts and which ones are okay to visit, but maybe not dwell over too much, and to devote additional time and effort to key concepts and experiences with their students. So not a rigid pacing guide, but a flexible roadmap to engage and empower students consistently and coherently.
Thank you. And finally, arguing again against pacing guides, we have Kwame. Kwame, you have 2 minutes, and your time begins now.
So I want to explicitly state that my partner and I are arguing against the mandated adherence to pacing guides in certain school districts. Although we believe that they do serve a purpose, we also believe that they can be detrimental because the progress of students should ultimately determine how fast or slow you get through a lesson. So often we interchange the term pacing guide with scope and sequence plan. To be clear, scope and sequence plans provide us with a span of skills we must teach, along with the order in which we teach them. Whereas pacing guides place a time limit for how long and how fast we should get through teaching a specific skill. Considering that many teachers who work in inclusive classroom settings have students who are multilingual, neurodivergent, have IEP or 504 plans, it's counterintuitive and counterproductive to standardize the amount of time it takes for a teacher to spend on a lesson. How can we teach in an era where we constantly spit out terms like UDL, differentiation, and scaffolding, but then place unrealistic time constraints on teachers to do those very things for their students? Who determines how long it takes for a student to achieve proficiency on a certain skill? Now, I also feel that pacing guides can be restrictive in the sense that it takes away autonomy from the teacher to pedagogically approach the math topics in a way that benefits students. As teachers, we're instructional artists, which means that when we are empowered and are trusted to do our jobs, it leads to better quality instruction, which in turn will yield increased student engagement and higher results. So I want to leave you all with 2 questions. Number 1, who are the pacing guides for? And then secondly, what exactly are we pacing towards?
Excellent. Thank you all. That was a wonderful opening. You've already given us so much to think about. And I'm debating whether I want my class to be fresh and locally sourced or be more thoughtfully planned out in advance. We'll dig into this in a moment here. I think, and Kwame, you kind of brought this up already, there's a lot of maybe gray vagueness around what is a pacing guide or how much should we follow it. I think that's where this really debate can lean into here. And so maybe can I just go around the room here and hear from each of you just what in your idea, like what is a pacing guide? Like how much should they follow it? Like, is it every lesson is spelled out in detail, or like just an outline for each lesson or outline for each? Like what is it mean by a pacing guide? Let me start with Hilary, and then we'll go to Farshid as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I do think that's the heart of this debate, which is what is a pacing guide? And Kwame, I was just nodding at what you were saying, yet at the same token, when you look in a curriculum, more than not, the scope and sequence and the pacing guide are synonymous. And so I agree with my opponents in many ways. And one of the things that I was highlighting as you both were talking were that we come from a lot of commonalities that we share in both of our arguments. And I think we all want student learning to be the center, right? And we don't want to put any mandates or anything on teachers. But the pacing guide itself is really, in my mind, an outline of here's the content for the year. Here's the estimated amount of time, not per lesson, but per unit in general, based on the amount of standards that we have and based on the major content area of a grade level, where we would prefer the focus to be so that all students can meet the grade level initiatives.
And Farshid, is that what you're kind of imagining for pacing guides, or what is your vision?
Pretty much. I mean, I think just listening to Kwame and Berkeley, as well as Hilary, talk about this, I think the notion of centering students and their experiences, I don't think that's up for debate. I think looking at a pacing guide as a rigid, you must do this independent of who your students are, is frankly a way to dismiss the roadmaps and starting points. So any trajectory should be flexible, right? Any progression has a sense of not just A to B, but how do we get there? What are the multiple pathways to get there? So I think the idea of, if you want your food cooked to order and you walk in and the person says, I have no idea, I could give you your food tomorrow or next week or in 30 seconds, right? I'm pretty sure that you want at least a sense, and then find out how do we actually get there together intentionally and specifically to meet the needs. So pacing guides as a starting point and as a way to collaborate, discuss, debate, that given the context of any school and any group of students, what's a starting point, not the ending point.
Then let me go to the other side here with Berkeley and Kwame. So when you say you're against pacing guides, what are you envisioning, or what range of things are you envisioning in the pacing guide category?
So just to be clear, Chris, we're against the mandated adherence to pacing guides. So I want to be very clear about the language, because like Hilary said, I do believe that pacing guides are beneficial to all teachers, not just early career teachers or novice teachers. Even veteran teachers could benefit from a pacing guide. I look at pacing guides as a scaffold, depending on who uses the pacing guide, right? There's some of us who are more extemporaneous. We like to supplement. I'm a supplementer. I like to search the internet and find different resources, different websites that can provide me with a better way to address a standard that I'm teaching students. But then there's some who maybe they need to use the textbook. Maybe they need to follow the pacing guide more to a T, which is also fine as well. The way I look at it, Chris and Rob, the pacing guide should be used as a way of equity, right? You have some who need the pacing guide more than others. But then if we're coercing people to follow the pacing guide to a T, which does happen in certain school districts, then it becomes a form of paternalism, because now we're pigeonholing them to do math or to teach math in a way that they deem is the right way to teach math. And that reinforces some of those white supremacist characteristics that we do talk about.
Yeah, I'm confused by your initial question. Is it, what are pacing guides? Is it, what do I want pacing guides to be?
I'm just trying to get at what when you say you're not in favor of pacing guides or the mandated of pacing guides, what are you envisioning as pacing guides? Like how detailed are they?
Yes. So I think you might be asking, like, what is the level of measure right here? And I think Hilary was talking about number of lessons, that a pacing guide delineates lessons. And I think for me, what I see and hear most in the field is that people talking about that they're behind because they're only on lesson 17. So it's broken down by number of days that lead up to a particular assessment, rather than thinking bigger picture about the big ideas of mathematics, of the grade level. And I would argue even that the Common Core state standards, for example, are a pacing guide in and of themselves. They're saying, here's what you learn in fourth grade, here's what you learn in fifth grade. And even though that's more on the unit level of a year, I think that can still sometimes put us in narrow our focus too much. And I'll say one final thing. I think there's a difference between what pacing guides are and the way that they are perceived in the field by teachers.
Great. So I'm going to actually go to Kwame and Berkeley, come right back to you with a follow-up here. So, and Kwame, you made it clear, like you're against the mandated adherence to these pacing guides. And I just wonder, what do you say to, and I've had this experience in the past 20 years of school leadership roles. What do you say to someone when they have a teacher who is really just kind of going rogue and they say they're doing it best for the students, but they are really barely even teaching anything related to math content from what you can see? Like, if you don't say follow pacing guide, what can I say instead?
So Chris, just to clarify, and I'll even share a story. So I was teaching in Boston Public Schools, 7th and 8th grade math, shout out to Boston Public Schools. And I was in a district where we had, I believe that year we had Connected Math. That was our curriculum. So we had all the different workbooks and everything. And I was coming from charter schools in Philly where we didn't have textbooks. So I was forced to supplement and look for resources that would benefit my students. And when I did that, their test scores were up there. They still grew every year, in spite of the fact that I didn't have textbooks. So I'm coming from that school of thought. So I was just going about it that way. And the math instructional coach at the time noticed that I wasn't really using the textbook and following the pacing guide to a T. But I was following as far as the skills that we're supposed to teach. I was doing it in order based on the scope and sequence. But I may have taken longer with certain skills based on the students who were in my class, because we may have needed an extra day or two to revise a lesson or whatever. So she goes to the principal, pretty much reports me and says I wasn't following the pacing guide. I go to the principal and pretty much explain what I've been doing with the kids. We have our first interim assessment. Kids blowing out the water. That same instructional coach that told on me behind my back tried to give me a high five. And of course, I wasn't feeling that, but I had to be professional. I gave it a high five back, because we're a team at the end of the day. But I say that to say, Chris, that as a math major, as someone that has content knowledge and a strong understanding of standards, so in this case, Common Core standards, which is what a lot of us have to follow, some iteration of it in this country, right? I had the ability to do that. But there's some people who try to do it, but they don't have the content knowledge. They don't have the ability to unpack a standard and figure out the depths of knowledge that are required to make that task rigorous for students. Those are additional skills that you need. So I just want to make sure that I provide that context for our audience so they know exactly where I'm coming from with that.
Can I hop in? I want to really be clear. Like, I don't think Farshid and I'm speaking for you, Farshid, but I feel like I know you really well at this point. We're not saying follow a curriculum with fidelity, which is what I think ends up becoming the message with a pacing guide. You must do it with fidelity. I think we're talking about doing it with integrity. And with integrity means that you're doing it justice, that you're looking at the curriculum as a mathematical story, that you're seeing the really important components, like you just said, Kwame, and you're supplementing where you feel like you can lift and personalize the curriculum for your students, but you're not doing so in a way that derails that mathematical story and ultimately makes you miss an entire content area by the end of the year where your students' peers have gotten exposure to that content.
So to continue with the points that Hilary was raising regarding the integrity aspect, I think, again, we need to be careful and we need to learn from our fellow teachers and educators that if we position it as something that we're thinking through strictly from the standpoint of time versus theme, I think that's a big discussion point. So Should it be differently timed and experienced and explored? 100%. I don't think any of us are arguing for that rigidity. But the notion that we need to pace the journey with our students so that thematically and through a progression that has been explored, that shouldn't happen in isolation, so that we benefit from collaboration, we benefit from expertise, we benefit from the ideas of, these are the big key ideas in mathematics K-12. And so if we don't actually get to specific points of discussion along these different themes, then we don't see the full picture. I'm not saying how fast we should get there. I'm just saying that thematic approaches actually enrich experiences.
I'm going to come to Hilary and Farshid about, Hilary, you talked about leaders misusing pacing guides in your opening. And we all know that that happens. So I guess my question would be, how can we, work with leaders, whether if we're a teacher, how can we work with leaders to help them understand purpose behind the pacing guides?
Well, I think leaders need professional development in the same way that all teachers are receiving professional development. And oftentimes, leaders have been in their position for quite some time and have both feet out of the classroom. And so I always encourage leaders to co-plan and co-teach with their teachers, which rarely happens as a principal, but I think it's important to be doing that because you have to remember what it's like to be a teacher. And especially be a teacher right now. I don't want to say post-COVID, but like post the emergency pandemic COVID. Because those leaders were not teachers during those moments, most likely. And so it's hard to know and remember what it feels like. So I think that's the first key. And I think the second part is continual professional learning and development. Many leaders themselves were not math majors or didn't have a math background. And I think thinking about the math curriculum is different than the way they think about other subjects. And so the way they feel about pacing guides in mathematics might be different. I don't have that data, but it could possibly be different. And so because they don't understand the math as well, maybe they're more rigid about following the pacing guide. So I just think leaders need more knowledge about how it all works, how the math story plays out, and understanding the content as much as their teachers do.
If I could sort of continue along those lines, unfortunately, a lot of our students go through their mathematical journey almost hopping from one island to the next. If they don't know, for instance, I'm talking about number concepts, number operations, algebraic thinking, what's the connection between them, right? Even like I've been in education for 25 years and I'm still learning from my students and my teachers and my colleagues and my administrators because that's how education works. So the idea that you need to sort of pace differently at different times, again, absolutely. But if you're helping, I live in Orlando, so we have a lot of theme parks, right? If you're going to go through and then have some sense of a coherent, joyful experience through a theme park, you need to understand that random is not it, right? And it's not about how fast you go through, and it's not even necessarily about do you hit every single ride or experience the same. It's about what are the themes. You need to understand this section is about this section is about this, and these are the transitions in between them. If our teachers don't have at least a starting point to collaborate, to build, to engage students on that, we are leaving them to figure those things out and either relying on some incoming, potentially different set of experiences, or we're just saying, well, your students may not need that consistency. Maybe other students do. And then that's even more dangerous and hugely connected to inequities that exist across schools, even within the same district, no less within different school districts around the country.
And going over to the other side to kind of as a follow-up to this, Kwame and Berkeley with first-year teachers and new maybe first, second, third year teachers, how can we stress or should we stress the importance of a pacing guide without stressing the importance of like the mandate if they're in a situation where it is like a mandate? Like how do we talk with first, second, third year teachers through something like that? Somebody who's brand new, that they haven't experienced it yet.
Just to respond quickly to what Farshid said, I agree with everything that Farshid said in terms of the thematic experiences and getting students to see the connectivity of the math that they're learning and understanding that there is a continuum that exists with all the different skills. But I think that's the utopian world that we all want to be in. But the reality is, in order for students to see the connectivity, it requires time, and it does require understanding where students are in terms of the needs that they have as learners. So there's going to be some scaffolding involved, which once again requires time, which cannot be standardized. Now, to answer the question about first-year teachers, I think it's a difficult question to answer because depending on what state you're in, depending on what district you're in, there are certain districts that provides teachers with more autonomy as far as how they should use the pacing guide. And then there's some that are a bit more rigid and say, hey, you need to follow the pacing guide. So the best advice that I would give first-year teachers is to follow your intuition and let your students be the guide. So we've heard a lot of conversation, even from Hilary. She talked about the importance of centering students. If we're truly centering students, then that means that we're using them as the guide to dictate pedagogically and even sequentially how we approach different math topics. Because who knows, you may have to do a small group. You may have some guided math groups where you're pulling kids out and you're providing some remediation or revising certain skills that are lacking in their foundation. Because we do know that a lot of students who are coming from elementary school, they do come with certain gaps of understanding that at the middle school level we have to address. But in order to do that and still be accountable to the different grade level skills that they need to learn in order to perform on an assessment, that all takes time. It takes time to do. So I think for first year teachers, they just have to be number one, trust their intuition, but they also need the space and the time during their practicum to try out different things, to experiment while they're still building their capacity around the content that they're going to ultimately teach in the schools that they're in.
And I'll add on to that by saying that what will scare new teachers away from taking risks that could benefit their students? It could be documents that delineate a day-by-day, series of lessons that you need to teach, instead of showing how much time there is to get to know your students and the math that they're already doing with their families, the math that's already happening in the community. You can ask them to go and take a photo and bring it back to math class where you can notice and wonder about it. Then they're doing the lesson planning for you, right? Then you're getting to know the students, how they see mathematics. You're getting to learn some more mathematics yourself. But I think sometimes the danger of these documents, especially for new teachers, is that they feel like that you have to follow them, right? That sometimes is the hidden message, and that sorry, I'm going to need to. I have too many notes. Give me one more second. So I was saying, oh yeah, that then the risk taking.
I think you need a pacing guide for this.
I agree.
Yeah.
I don't think this is cooked to order. This is pre-made.
Ouch. You could leave that in if you want. Just
All
cut
the
out
love
some of
burning.
That
my
was
stuff.
good.
No, that was good. That was
good.
too good.
Okay.
That was
Yeah.
too good. Yeah, hold on. I don't remember. You just have to come back to me. Sorry.
That's okay. We'll move on a little bit here, and you can always throw that.
No,
back
sorry.
in. Oh,
I
go ahead.
remembered. Okay, I remembered. So I think the risk for new teachers is that they think that they have to follow day by day, which can put this unnecessary pressure on them in a way that we don't get a chance to see how interconnected math is from year to year, right? So if you teach third grade, you're worried about getting them ready for fourth grade, of course. But if you see all the connections in mathematics and you learn those connections over time, you're going to feel less stressed about having to follow day by day.
I have a question. I'm going to come back to you, Berkeley and Kwame. I'm just thinking about in like a bigger school, like think about like there's a dozen courses of algebra 1 or something, right? And if you and I are both teaching algebra 1 and so are some other people, to what degree do you want us to be on the same page? You know, because each of our sections, each of our courses is going to have a little bit different experience, and the students will be a little bit different. And so, should we, for each day, do something similar or a similar topic, or just similar tests, or is it just kind of a really open, wild frontier?
I remember from when teaching high school, when I had multiple Algebra 2 classes, pretty much there was not a single day when each of the different periods finished on the exact same time. My goal was to communicate and collaborate with the teachers. So we had specific tasks that were connected and guided by those specific learning goals and the big ideas. And then try to make sure that unit by unit, we got to sort of pausing moments together. It's almost like when you're going on a journey, on a car trip again, right? You don't need to follow each other bumper to bumper. You just need to make sure that we want to make sure that we get to this point. Let's meet up at point A and then point B. You pace based on the people in your car. That's the student-centered way, right? Sometimes you might need to slow up. Sometimes you might need to slow down. Slow up doesn't work. Sometimes you might need to go a little faster. Sometimes you might need to slow up. But the goal is, let's plan on communicating clearly. Let's meet up at this juncture. But it's not about time. It's about theme, and it's about connections and coherence.
I love that, Farshid. And Berkeley and Kwame, thoughts on that? Like, where you stand in this situation?
You asked about high school. Can I talk about kindergarten and through fifth grade for a second?
But I'm thinking about like a big school though. We're all teaching the same content to some degree, or at the same grade level.
Got it.
Just I'm talking about like
So all
one
kindergarten
school.
teachers, for example.
Yeah.
So just to add to what Farshid said, because crazy, I do agree. I think if you have CPT or common planning time in your school, that's a great time to have those conversations with your content level partner about like where are you? Do you have certain students who need more time? How much more time do you need on this unit or this domain? You're not always going to be ending at the same pace, because if each class has a different set of students, and usually, at least where I was teaching, there was one class that had students who had IEPs. I had some students who were emerging bilinguals, students who had 504 plans. So I was going at a pace that was a little bit slower than what my grade partner was going, but we were still within the same domain. We were still teaching the same skills. We were still connected, even though we were in different parts within that unit. I think that is important to have that communication for sure. But there was something I wanted to add to that. And I think it kind of ties into just why standardized testing is problematic, right? Or even just the idea of teacher evaluation. We haven't talked about teacher evaluation. In the beginning of the year, at least in Massachusetts, at least in my district where I was in Boston Public Schools, we had to set a student learning goal. Okay, by what percent will your group grow over the course of the year? So over the course of the year, you had to collect artifacts to show student learning, which you had to post on an online platform, which changes year after year. You have to do assessments and provide some exemplars to show that kids are growing throughout the year, and also record it somewhere. These are all part of the teacher evaluation process. So when you have that over your head, sometimes that connectivity that Farshid is talking about can become more individualistic, sadly, because you're trying to reach a goal and save your job in the process, because your kids need to show a certain level of growth in order for you to still have a job at that school. And I think that's what makes standardized testing so problematic, especially as it pertains to how it impacts the quality of pedagogy, but also how we even view the teaching of math, because it goes from being something that's not as interconnected as it should be. Because we're just kind of going from standard to standard without actually seeing the prerequisites of the standards and how they're all connected together.
I'd love to bring in the parent perspective here. Not that I have twins, but if I were to have had twins, I'd really want my children to come out at the end of the year having exposure to the same content. And it would be helpful if it were at around the same time and the same pace if they're in two different classrooms, given that they're going to come home and share homework ideas and talk and all of those things. But more importantly, I would want them to both have access to the same mathematical content ideas. And so when I think about not having a pacing guide, I wonder, how do teachers make that happen if they don't have a pacing guide? How do they make sure that my twins are going to come out at the end of the year, not at the same level, but having had the same access to the mathematics that will get them to the next point in their mathematical journey?
Yeah, Berkeley, do you want to
Right.
weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that. So I'm thinking about how pacing guides often, when I talk with teachers, it seems like the pacing guides have zoomed us so far in to what we're teaching in one day to the next that we lose that bigger picture that I think Hilary's talking about, that two kids we want them to be on a similar journey in some way. So what does similar mean? And this goes back to Chris, your question about like, how do teachers collaborate? And how do we keep math connected across grade levels? I love to work with teachers on, okay, how could a multiplication problem type with different numbers based on your grade level get at some of the big ideas of your grade, right? So kindergarten teachers, like that example you saw from the kindergarten teacher, Megan Akins, right? For her, 6 times 7 was about how can the students model the problem? How can they count by ones? Some were counting on, some were adding, some were skip counting, or like in that transition to multiplicative thinking. So that's what it could look like in kindergarten, right? A 4th or 5th grade teacher might do something where there's a fractional amount in one of the groups. You have 12, you're making 12 recipes and each batch calls for 3/4 cup of brown sugar. How much brown sugar do you need, right? And in this way, the kindergarten teacher and the 5th grade teacher can talk about what will make sense to students, and you'll see some commonalities in the way that the students will approach those problems, right? 3/4 and 3/4 makes a half, right? And 7 and 7 is 14. Kids will kind of combine groups. And so I think when teachers can talk across grade levels, it will lower their stress because we've zoomed out to see how mathematics is connected rather than being zoomed in on what lesson number you're on and when the next assessment is coming.
Did the other teachers in Megan's grade level do the same thing? Would my twins get the same outcome there?
Good question. So her colleagues engage in cognitively guided instruction. So their planning time is spent kind of looking through student work, and they may or may not co-plan problems. But when we think about these ideas of themes that Farshid brought up, like they might co-plan around themes, but I think where they get targeted in their instruction is based on the strategies I saw today. How am I going to tweak the number choices? Or maybe I'm going to try a partitive division problem tomorrow instead of a multiplication problem. But that comes from knowing their students and understanding the trajectories of student thinking and reflecting each day and each week.
But just listening to, I think, the wonderful conversation, and this is such a privilege because I'm just learning even within the last, 45 minutes or an hour, the idea that to recognize children's brilliance, we need to have a sense of the big picture and the zoomed in picture simultaneously. So I would almost say, to Berkeley's point, not only should there be a pacing guide within a year, there should be a broader sense of a pacing scope and sequence across grades so that our colleagues, when we collaborate when I'm a second grade teacher and I'm doing, for instance, we've established whole numbers and we have concepts and we're doing addition and subtraction. This is what addition gets me by the time my students get to multiplication, right? Or if I'm stressing place value this much in kindergarten and first grade, when I get to decimals, oh, wait, this is based on place value, right? So that sense of, okay, so here's the sequence, here's how much we stress here, and here's how we can leverage that foundation next.
And that already exists in a lot of curriculum. There's curriculum maps that show the vertical alignment of the content and the mathematical story, which again brings us back to that big picture.
Okay, I think I just have one last question to kind of wrap things up. I'm just thinking about, like Kwame, you kept saying like the mandatory adherence, and just think about leaders, administrators who really believe in this like really strict adherence, and that you're going to get docked on your evaluation, as you were talking about. And I'm just wondering, can I go around the room here from each of you just very briefly? What is your advice to teachers how to talk to colleagues, admin, anyone who's really like pushing back against these great ideas that you're all sharing and saying like, just follow this, like, it's a script. Don't think, just follow it. Like, what advice do you have? And you want to start us off, Hilary?
I always start us off and then I don't get to think a little longer. I don't know that I have advice for that, because if you're under leadership like that, that leader's not really going to change. So, I that is their philosophy and their vision. And unless they are looking to do better and change their philosophy, I don't see that changing anytime soon. So my advice would be go find a place that lets you be you. But I'd love to hear what the others have to say and then maybe come back
Yeah,
to me.
we'll come back to you if you'd like. I want to go in, Farshid.
Yeah, so when I have opportunities to be in schools, so recently I was in a K-6 school, and the idea was, well, how about if you work with our first grade team, our second grade team, our fourth grade team? And I said, no, we have to actually be in the same space. So we get a sense of the K-6 progression, we get a sense of the scope and sequence, and then we actually break out into small groups, and then we talk through that, and then we come back together. What do we have to learn from each other? So again, it's not either or, it's got to be both.
I think with admin, it's important for admin to have context. I think context is key. So in a lot of good schools, school leaders, whether we're talking principals or even just instructional coaches, before they have that evaluation or do that observation with you, usually there's a pre-observation meeting where you talk about the context. Like, what am I going to see when I come into your classroom? This is their chance to get to understand the dynamics of your classroom, the dynamics of your students. And quite frankly, if they're really in tune with who you are and engage with your students, they probably have visited your class on multiple occasions prior to that pre-observation meeting. That's what should happen. But what tends to happen is the meeting or the observation is more of a one-off, just to get something down on paper, just to say, hey, I did your observation, now I gotta move on to this one. And this is something that happens in much bigger schools where there are a lot of teachers and staff and faculty you have to cover within a small period of time. And then you have to submit all that to the district. So principals are under pressure to get these things done on top of all the other operational things that they do on a daily basis. So I think it's hard to give, like Hilary said, it's hard to just tell principals what they should do. I would say that if a principal has been in your shoes before as an instructor, as a facilitator, I think that's a starting point. As far as in terms of being more empathetic towards their faculty members.
And Berkeley?
I'm going to go back to what Hilary said. I'm going to say to my leader, come co-teach with me, come co-plan with me. Then we'll find out what's working, what's not working, right? Because if we believe that students deserve to choose which strategy to use and how to model, which I believe, then it's lesson 12 says that we're showing kids how to make a 10, If that doesn't make sense to students, I'm not going to spend time on that. I'm going to say, use the strategy and model that makes sense to you. And then what happens today is going to determine what's going to happen tomorrow. So I'm not just going to go on to lesson 13, which is introducing a different strategy that may or may not make sense to kids. I'm going to follow students' thinking. And when you're in it with me, you'll see which documents are or are not supporting my journey.
And then
All
Hilary,
right,
do you want to change your
I
answer?
take what Berkeley said. Just rewind.
Just ditto that.
No, but I
Okay.
do still believe that you hold true to yourself. And if you're not happy where you are and you aren't getting heard, you have the absolute right to find the place where you are happy, because you're going to be a better teacher.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And I think that concludes our questioning round.
We will now end by giving each side 2 minutes to make their final arguments to you. And we will begin with the side arguing in favor of pacing guides, Hilary and Farshid. The floor is yours.
Well, what we haven't heard on this call yet is what teachers do without a pacing guide to ensure that all students have access to the same learning outcomes by the end of the year. It's clear that we do all share the same vision, that classrooms should be student-centered and personalized to student needs. Yet we also agree that some consistency across classrooms with regard to content will allow for equitable access to exposure to important math concepts.
In our conversations, we were talking about supporting teachers so we can support our students. Think of that driving example that we gave you earlier. If we don't give them at least an initial GPS, an initial way of finding a pathway forward or multiple pathways forward, what happens when we need to actually differentiate for who's on the journey with us, when one road is not actually getting us to our destination? So by having multiple pathways and having a starting plan and then being flexible and intentional enough through collaboration, then we can successfully bring the people through the journey successfully.
Thank you. And with the final word, we have the side arguing against pacing guides with Kwame. Kwame, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. So in his book, MC Means Move the Class, Dr. Sean Woodley talks about teachers needing the freedom to be creators in the classroom. And he says, teaching is one of those careers that allows you to demonstrate artistry in an almost unfathomable variety of ways. The more you do it, the better you get at it. When I began to see myself as a creator, a master of the mix in my classroom, I began to feel more empowered. So when we empower teachers, we also empower students. Imagine if our pacing guides weren't structured around our state test. Imagine that. We would be able to have this utopian world that my opposing colleagues have eloquently stated. Hilary talking about, if I had 2 children learn the same thing, how would they demonstrate their learning? Well, let's think about this. Instead of a standardized test, how about a portfolio-based assessment that actually provides not only them the ability to just show how they're demonstrating their learning, but to Farshid's point about thematic experiences, they're able to create that story of how they've been able to travel this math journey that they've traveled throughout the year and really talk about the stuff that they've had along the way. That's the type of math classroom that we all want. And if we're able to provide teachers with the space to decide how they could best use the pacing guide, we can all achieve this unified vision of mathematical learning for our students.
Thank you all. And that concludes this debate. You've given us so many great insights, so much to think about. I thank you all for being here.
And now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the arguments, share with your friends and colleagues, and consider what resonated with you. Be sure to go to our Twitter at DebateMathPod to share your thoughts on this debate. Which side do you lean towards?
And huge thanks to all four of our guests. Oh my gosh, I could sit and listen to the four of you all day long. It was such a rich and thoughtful discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't go on for 3 more hours of this, but it was wonderful. You were so thoughtful, and you listened to each other, responded to each other. You showed just what great discourse really can be.
And thanks to all those who are listening. We hope you enjoyed this and learned a ton from this episode. Please, please, please go out, have the conversation. How do you feel about pacing guides?
And as we wrap up, Hilary, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @dr_ my last name Kreisberg. Good luck spelling that.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And Farshid, where can people find you?
I'm also on Twitter @Farshid Safi. That was not taken, surprisingly. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation. And thank you all.
And Kwame, where can listeners find you?
They can find me at my main website, Identity Talk 4 educators.com, or on Twitter under my handle @IdentityShaper.
And Berkeley, where can listeners find you?
Hey, so I'm at berkeley.everett.com and also on Twitter @Berkeley.
All right, that's it. Thanks, everyone.